Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Happy New Year. This is our unfinished business seminar, the first of our spring term, and I'm really happy that this seminar is kicking off with Dr. Federico Botana. Federico obtained his PhD from the Courtauld Institute of Art. And this work formed the basis of his 2012 book, The Works of Mercy in Italian Medieval Art, circa 1050 to 1400. And since then, he's been working a lot on manuscripts, including a project at Reading on the manuscript Egerton, 1500. He was awarded a Leverhulme Trust Fellowship for his project on visual pedagogy in Renaissance Tuscany, which was at Queen Mary. And he has recently published a book, Learning Through Images in the Italian Renaissance, Illustrated Manuscripts and Education in Quattrocento, Florence. That's Cambridge UP 2020. And he is a member of Dr. Laura Cleaver's Cultivate MSS team, and he's working on pan-European activities of Italian book dealers. So let's welcome Federico. Thanks, Federico.
Hello to everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Christopher, for the great introduction. And thank you for organizing this. Also, thanks to Ellie and Georgia for organizing this seminar. Before I start, I would like also to express my gratitude to Susanna Vanocci, who I don't know if she's here, who is the responsible for the Orski's card index in the Giunta Regionale Toscana, who gave me access to the cards to study them. Also, especially to Eduardo Barbieri, who gave me one or two hints about how to tackle the cards. And to everybody in the team, especially to Laura for sharing information on Orski, other things that Orski didn't have. So we are all putting threads together in a way. So it's completely collective work. Okay, so I am going to start. Everybody can see the presentation?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, what's going on now? Okay. I didn't know which button to touch, sorry. So these vintage cabinets, like those we may find today in an antique shop, are actually important cultural artifacts. They contain the card index of Leo S. Orski, usually referred to as the Schedario Orski. The cards are filled with detailed information on books and manuscripts sold by the firm from its beginnings in the late 19th century to the post-war period. The Schedario has already been studied by Eduardo Barbieri, who published an article on the card indexes of the three great Italian book dealers, Orski, Giuseppe Martini, and Ulrico Höpli. I have decided to apply an archaeological approach to the Schedario to look for evidence of who produced and used these cards and what were their functions. As we may expect, the cards provide information on sale prices and occasionally on cost prices, and sometimes they might tell us where and when Orski bought a manuscript and when and to whom he sold it. But this is not all. As I shall demonstrate in this paper, the cards can reveal where manuscripts were stored and displayed, and more interestingly, they can shed light on how catalogue entries were drafted and even the ways in which Orski and his collaborators worked together to produce promotional material to the highest standards. But before discussing these topics in detail, a few words about Leo Orski. Leo Samuel Orski, better known today as a publisher, was one of the most successful antique book dealers of the 20th century. Public libraries across Europe and North America include in their collections important manuscripts which were traded by Orski at some point or another. For example, this superb 13th century Italian Bible. today in the Walters in Baltimore. And this lavish 15th century Trésor des Sapiens also in the Walters. Private collectors like Henry Walters, J.P. Morgan, and Frank McLean were enthusiastic clients of Olszki. Walters bought 150 manuscripts from him. Leo Samuel Olszki was born in Johannesburg in East Prussia in 1861 to a printer and typographer father who specialized in Talmudic texts. In 1881, after completing his humanistic secondary schooling, he was engaged as apprentice in a bookshop in Berlin, S. Calvary and Company. He was quickly promoted to assistant, but decided to move to Italy because of health problems. In 1883, he obtained a position in an antique bookshop in Verona, the Libreria Münster, and 3 years later, in 1886, he opened his own bookshop, also in Verona, and produced his first catalog. This is actually not his first catalog, but it's one of the first, the oldest one I could get an image of. He also started publishing then, in 1886, the Bulletin mensuel des derniers achats, a monthly listing of the shop's new acquisitions. In 1890, he transferred his shop to Venice, and in 1897, he established his headquarters in Florence, where the firm is still based today. Success was such that in 1914, he opened a branch in Rome, and soon afterwards another one in Geneva. Olszki was a publisher from the outset. In addition to printing his own catalogs, in 1886, he founded l'Alighieri, a journal dedicated to the study of Dante, and in 1899, he founded La Bibliophilia, which has published from the start articles by eminent scholars, amongst them Leopold de Lille, Eugène Müntz, Paolo d'Ancona, Carlo Frati, and the many others who followed. La Bibliophilia regularly published features on books traded by Olszki, notably the Manuscrits Précieux, which included color illustrations already by 1910. By this time, Olszki had developed one of the most successful enterprises ever to combine luxury publishing with academic rigor. Early testimonies include the 1911 monumental edition of Dante's Commedia and a series of portfolios containing reproductions of drawings in the Uffizi. After the Great War, his second and third sons, Cesare and Aldo, became increasingly involved in the business, but Leo did not retire until 1938, when, because of the racial laws promulgated by Mussolini, he moved to Switzerland, where he died in 1940. Let's now turn our attention to the skedaddle. The skedario consists of 3 file cabinets of different widths, but all roughly 1.70 meters tall. The cabinets with their contents were acquired by the Soprintendenza ai Beni Librari della Regione Toscana in the 1980s and are today the property of the Consiglio Regionale della Toscana. Together with the 3 cabinets add up to a total of 81 drawers. As to the number of cards they contain, Eduardo Barbieri suggested 100,000, but I suspect this is a conservative figure and there are actually far more cards. Cards contain information on books traded by Olszki from the beginnings of the firm in the 1890s to the 1960s, including manuscripts and early printed books, as well as contemporary publications. The oldest cards are written by hand, usually in French. Typed cards were introduced in the 1920s, first typed in blue and soon afterwards in black. Many cards include clippings from sale catalogs, either Olszkis, as we see on the left, or other dealers, like the Sotheby's catalog entry we see on the right. Cards are classified alphabetically according to author and title. In the absence of a known author, they are arranged according to subject or title. As to the information they contain, the main text consists of a description and might include historical information, just like a catalog entry. We also find series of letters and numbers, often written by different hands. Amongst these, the most important are the accession numbers, which were not just given to manuscripts, but to every type of book traded by Olszki, and I suspect also to prints, cuttings from manuscripts, etc. These numbers help us establishing when a manuscript was acquired. For example, in the Bulletin Mensuel published in 1900, the higher accession numbers are in the 22,000s, whereas in the catalogs produced in 1910, the higher numbers are in the 32,000s. And in manuscripts traded in the mid-30s, we find accession numbers above 46,000. A different system, combining letters and numbers, seems to have been used around 1890, And another similar system was introduced in the 1930s. I haven't worked those systems out yet. In some instances, cards include a catalog entry number. These are usually written in pencil, which suggests that they refer to the most recently published catalog at the time. We also find shelf marks, usually typically a series of capital letters. Cards may also include shorthand notes of many sorts. Some refer to the places where a manuscript was kept. For example, CF, which must stand for Casaforte, that is, safe. In some instances, we find several of such notes on the same card. For instance, this antiphonary was kept in a safe in the shop on the Lungarno Corsini in Florence, and was at some point placed above a cupboard in a study, as we read here, sopra l'armadio studio. While this other antiphonary was displayed on a lectern in a salone, as we read here, Legio Salone, perhaps in the Olszki villa. These notes do not just have anecdotal value. They can reveal for how long a manuscript remained unsold. For example, this missal was number 26,019, which indicates that it was bought by Olszki about 1905. However, the note course suggests that it was still in his possession in 1926, when the firm opened the shop on the Lungarno Corsini. In other cases, we might discover that the manuscript was sold and later bought back. This card describes a 15th century manuscript of Petrarca's Sonnets and Triumphs, today in Boston Public Library. The accession number is 35,778 indicates that it was bought by Olszki in the 1910s, but we discover written in pencil Ot 1941, meaning Ottobre 1941. Thus we might conclude that this manuscript remained unsold for 30 years. However, this was not the case. We discovered the same manuscript in the catalog of Hoeple's 1925 auction of the Demarinus collection. True, manuscripts of Petrarca's poems were seriously produced in Quattrocento Florence, Moreover, the provenance chains of this manuscript do not mention Olszki at all. But there can be little doubt it's the same manuscript, since, in addition to the same number of folios and the same illustrations, they both include a shield with the Strozzi arms and a folio torn in half. Now, if we look again at the card, we discover written in pencil above the date Ottobre 1941, ora nostro. That means now ours, which verifies that the manuscript had not always been in Olszki's hands. Very importantly, at least for our project, some of the cards include prices. In many instances, they correspond to those in the catalogs. In others, they do not. What is more, some cards include several prices. For example, the card for this book of Hours, sold to Herbert Strauss around 1930. In the verse of the card, we can read 32,000 and 50,000, presumably prices in lire and francs, as well as $4,000. We might assume the price asked to Strauss. Another interesting case, this moral treatise advertised for 150 francs in the Bulletin Mensuel in 1901. The prices in the corresponding card include 400 lire or francs, they were the same at the time, they had the same value, and $80, which suggests the manuscript was sold to an American collector. In fact, $80 were the equivalent of 416 francs or lire in 1901. Sometimes cards include cost prices. For example, the card for this breviary, also referred to as Psalter, which in the 19th century was in the collection of the Earl of Kilmorey and was probably bought by Olszki in London. Interestingly, Olszki does not appear in the provenance chains, neither in the Schoenberg database nor in the digital scriptorium, which provided this, the image we are seeing on the screen. On the front of the card, we read 4,000, presumably the price Olszki was asking at the time. On the back, we read costo 2,800 lire, presumably the equivalent of 110 pounds in the early 1900s. Interestingly, Quaritch was offering the manuscript for 325 pounds in 1902. So Olszki might have got the manuscript half price if he got it from Quaritch. Similarly, this Bible sold to J.P. Morgan sometime around 1910. The price asked by Olszki was 10,000 francs, while the cost had been 7,050 lire, which makes Olszki, gives Olszki a benefit of 50%, if I'm right. Cards might also reveal from whom Olszki bought the manuscript. Notably, these clippings from Sotheby's catalogs. Also, a card might tell us to whom a manuscript was sold. For instance, this book of Hours, which was apparently sold to the Danish collector Valerius Ragozzi in 1938 and was presumably shipped to this address in Denmark. However, for me, the most fascinating aspect of these cards is that they appear to have been in constant or regular change, almost like living organisms. As I shall now demonstrate, their function was not just storing information. This feature, published in a Bibliophilia in 1914, advertises a manuscript of Federico da Venezia's commentary on the Apocalypse, which was later bought by Henry Walters. The corresponding card includes several corrections. When we compare the text of the card corrections included with the text in La Bibliofilia, we discovered that they are almost identical. Especially revealing is the description of the miniature representing Christ as the judge of the nations, which you just have seen. In the card was first written dans la bouche la glaive, meaning with the sword in his mouth, which was changed into à travers la bouche la glaive, and in the final version, la glaive à travers la bouche, which literally means the sword across the mouth. Indeed, a more visually evoking turn of phrase to describe the image. This led me to conclude that the card was actually used to draft the text published in the Bibliofilia. Catalog clippings were also used to draft new catalog entries. For example, this card included a clipping from Olszki's catalog number 56, Choix des livres anciens, rares et curieux, seconde partie, published sometime before 1905. The title, originally in French, Traité vétérinaire, was translated into Latin as Tractatus Veterinarius, and the word ornement was replaced by encadrement. Sorry. The word velan was added on the recto, and on the verso, 2 full sentences and a clause describing the manuscript in further detail. Moreover, next to the excerpt reproduced in a smaller print was written in pencil non si stampa, not to be printed. This manuscript probably remained unsold for several years, as we find it again in catalog number 74, Manuscrit sur Velan, published in 1910. The entry in this catalog reproduces word by word the corrected text on the card. We read Tractatus Veterinarius instead of Traité vétérinaire, the word Velan after the accession number, encadrement instead of ornement, and in a smaller print, the 2 sentences, the sentences written by hand on the verse of the card instead of the excerpt reproduced in catalog 56. As I shall now reveal, the Skedario can shed light on how Leo Olszki and his employees collaborated in the drafting of catalog entries. The card described in this book of hours is a fascinating example. It was sold to Henry Walters in 1912 and had previously been advertised in catalogs 73 and 74, both published in 1910. The text is exactly the same in both catalogs. The card includes numerous corrections, all by the same hand who wrote the text. The differences between the card and the published text are revealing. The word listeau was replaced by listel, a more appropriate term in this context. Les numéros 1 et 3 sont très bien exécutés en grisaille was changed into les premiers et les derniers sujets sont en grisaille et d'une exécution remarquable, très soignée. En les tout est exécuté, en les tout est exécuté soigneusement et d'un espace exigu was replaced by les tout est exécuté avec grande finesse et dans un petit espace. In both instances, demonstrating a better use of the French language. Also, 2 sentences were swapped over, and in between was written voltare, turn over. And voila. On the verso, we discover another text in a different hand, undoubtedly the source of the last paragraph of the printed version. However, it was corrected in blue by the same hand who wrote the text in purple. Moreover, when we compare it with the printed version, we discover further corrections. Valeur artistique très considérable was changed into grande valeur artistique. Exemple into analog. The word absolument and très unnecessary here were not included in the final version. And the word aussi was moved to a place grammatically more suitable. You might be surprised to learn that the text in black was actually written by the top boss, Leo Olszki himself. As we discovered when we juxtaposed the text in black, we juxtaposed the card with a letter written by Leo to Henri Aumont in 1909. But who were the other individuals who wrote on the cards? In the 235 card entries I have examined up to now, I have identified 11 distinct handwritings, in addition to Leo's. His writing usually appears in notes and additions. In fact, so far, I have found only one card fully written by Leo. As to the other 11 hands, I have divided them into two groups. The first, which I have named hands O, include 8 different handwritings. The second group includes only 3, A, B, and C. The reason for the division is that the hands O share similar calligraphic traits, which are absent in the A, B, C hands. The later 4 hands O appear in cards with accession numbers that fit within the 1920s and 1930s, and have a more modern style. I shall now discuss individually the first 4 hands O for reasons that will become apparent in each case. Hand O1 is the earliest. We find it in a card describing a Virgil manuscript with the accession number 11,580, which indicates it was acquired by Olszki in the early or mid-1890s. The highest accession number that I found in a card in his hand is 24,434, which would correspond to a date around 1901. For hand O2, the lower accession number is 18,923, which appears on a card describing a moral treatise advertised in the Bulletin Mensuel in 1902. The higher number is for this hand is 26,672, which we find in a card describing a book of hours probably acquired before 1905. For hand O3, the lower accession number is 21,044, which suggests the card was written around 1900. And the higher accession number for this hand is 44,946, which takes us well into the 1930s. So the person who wrote these cards worked for Olszki for at least 30 years. Moreover, half of the cards I have examined so far were written by hand O3. By contrast, only one card can be attributed to hand O4, with accession number 31,461, suggesting a date around 1910. This is the only card from this period written in English I have found until now. Another reason for showing hand O4, its calligraphic style. Given the stylistic similarities in the early hands O, it is reasonable to assume that Olszki's employees were trained in calligraphy. And indeed, we discover calligraphy exercises in account books dating from the late 1880s. In fact, there was probably an in-house calligraphic style. As we can note in these documents, The first, a list of books drafted in the late 1880s. The second, a list of the autographed manuscripts of Gabriele D'Annunzio, bought by Olszki in 1910. Information about Olszki's employees in the early period is scarce. Secondary sources are silent on the subject. Only one name has been put forward so far, Fritz Mielke, whose death was reported in an obituary in La Bibliophilia in 1915. Mielke collaborated with Olszki in the preparation of catalogues. According to Aldo Olszki, Mielke started working with his father in Venice, so sometime in the 1890s, and continued working with him after he moved his headquarters to Florence in 1897. The last catalogue credited to Mielke, number 43, was published in 1900. Eduardo Barbieri suggested that Mielke was one of the persons behind the early cards. So, in turn, I propose that Mielke was hand 01, since the known dates of his employment at Olszki correspond to the accession numbers found in the cards written in this hand. As we can see on the screen, the cards written by hand 01 usually have very few or no corrections. Moreover, the editorial skills of this person are evident in this card, in which a text of a catalogue entry was punctiliously corrected. As to hand 02, I shall now reveal it belonged to a very well-known, even famous character, Papam, no other than Tamaro Demarinus. On the left, we see a draft by Demarinus for the introduction to the catalogue of Countess Sofia Coronini Fagan's collection of musical books, published in 1919. Both the draft and the card are populated by M's and N's that can hardly be distinguished from V's and U's. The DI and the TE starting and finishing the words dimorante on the draft and devotamente on the card are strikingly similar. We discover the same uppercase F's and the same two manners of double T's, one straight, the other recalling a star. Moreover, the uppercase D's are the same, and also are the uppercase S's, which look like L's. Tamaro Demarinus was born in Naples in 1878. He moved to Florence in 1900 when he was engaged to work for Olszki. In 1904, he founded his own bookshop and soon became one of the most important Italian dealers in the international book market. The accession numbers in the cards drafted by hand 02 perfectly fit the period 1900-1904. Now, hand 03 is for me the most intriguing, since this person collaborated with Olszki for at least 30 years. By contrast to hand 01, cards written by hand 03 include numerous corrections, especially those with the lower accession numbers. But in addition to French, hand 03 wrote well in Italian and also knew German. In fact, all the notes in German that I have found so far discovered in the Schedario occur in cards written by hand 03. On the left we read, now sorry for my German, Dreisen ein weiße Ekte ist mit Papier angesetzt, which probably meant one corner of folio 13 has been attached or replaced with white paper. And on the right, Miniaturen gewöhnlich, which I have translated as ordinary miniatures, as one may expect in many books of ours. In fact, these notes suggest that German was hand 03's native tongue, but could not have been Mielke, given that he or she, perhaps, was still working with Olszki in the 1930s. To conclude, I hope to have demonstrated that the Skedario Orszki is a mine of information worth exploring. From these old cards, it can be established when a manuscript was acquired by Orszki and, occasionally, how much he paid for, when it was sold, and even to whom and for how much. Also, we might discover how long a manuscript remained in his possession and where it was kept. In summary, the Skedario can be used to fill some of the gaps we encounter when compiling information from sale catalogs and library archives. More importantly, these cards can offer us a glimpse into how Leo Orszki and his team collaborated, compiling information and producing scholarly promotional material. Yet, much still remains unknown. I have inspected so far only 28 out of 81 drawers and studied about 1/3 of the cards describing manuscripts, in total 235 entries. In addition, I have not yet deciphered much of the numerical and alphabetical combinations we discover in the notes, and not even completely worked out the chronology of the accession numbers. And besides Leo Orszki and Tamaro Demarinus, I have not yet been able to identify those who wrote on these cards. There is a strong possibility, however, even a probability, that Hando 1 was Fritz Mielke, who worked with Orszki between sometime in the 1890s and the early 1900s. So for around 10 years, but no significant clues as to the identity of Hand 03, who collaborated with Orszki for at least 30 years. Hand 01, 02, and 03 seem to have overlapped around 1900. One may assume that the most senior, Hand 01, supervised the other two. In fact, we find Hands 01 and 03 sometimes on the same card, but impossible to tell whether their interventions happened at the same time. In summary, this is not an unfinished business, it has only just begun. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you so much for that. Such a great combination of information science, digitization. I even enjoyed the elements of textual scholarship, but the preparation of these texts for bibliophilia is really interesting. So the way that we'll conduct the Q&A is you can either type in a question in the chat if you'd prefer to do so, or you can click on the bottom of your Zoom client on the reactions button, and you should see a raise hand icon. So if you raise your hand, I'll be able to find you and unmute you so that you can ask a question yourself. It's up to you. Let's open up for questions for Federico.
Ready, fire.
We're at that wonderful moment of a Zoom event when all I see is names with gray boxes, and then there are a few others. Right, we have one question in the chat from Peter. Can you tell us what his price code was?
What do you mean by price code? If you can unmute yourself and tell me, because it's a price code.
The ending price he paid for books?
The node in, I'm not familiar with that word, sorry, I'm sort of...
So I think the point is that on some of your cards you have strings of letters, Federico, and we would assume that those are ways of disguising prices. In lots of other cards, we will find people using Yates Thompson famously does this, that he will put, you know, BEE to stand for whatever that would be, you know, several £100 instead of writing out the number, so that anybody that comes across that doesn't immediately know how much he's paid for it. Is that true in the cards that you've found? Or?
I think that would be fantastic, and if we could sort it out. But Angeline, our colleague Angeline Rice, told me that in fact the Rosenthal had a similar shelf mark system. So I haven't yet been able to work that out, but I'll investigate that. Thank you very much, because it could be that could be why you don't find cost prices that often, and you find them only in very few cards. Yeah.
Laura had a question too. Do you just want to ask that question, Laura?
I do. I wondered whether your mysterious hand 3 that sticks around for 30 years could be one of the sons. Doesn't he take one or more of his business with him?
Or Aldo, I think I saw their handwriting somewhere in one of the books. They published 2 very nice books for 2 anniversaries of Orski's. One, I think it was in 1990 something, and the other in the early 2000s. And I think I saw drafts by him, and it didn't seem to be it didn't seem to be them. But there is one actually of the later hand of 4s that could be one of them. Yeah, but I haven't yet. Yeah. But again, I have to check that again, and I need to go to the archives to. This is very. It is a possibility. Yeah.
Oh, what a joy that would be, wouldn't it?
We'll just sob collectively now. Yeah.
Olivia, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yes. Hello. Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. I'm curious about the fact that he filed his cards alphabetically by title, and what and I noticed that on at least one of the cards that you showed us, he had changed, or somebody had changed a title from French, I think, to Latin.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to, I mean, I suppose it's just an early patterns kind of thing, but whether you got a sense of the way that they're titling these manuscripts and where those titles are coming from. Are they coming from the catalogs that they purchased them from? I mean, it's interesting that they changed one. Are there any that don't have titles and are therefore done by author or subject, or any kind of your observations on titles and how those work?
The titles, so basically the author is the main thing. Now within the authors, there are sections by authors, and then the subsections by title or types of work. For example, when you have Cicero, when you have plenty of stuff, you have Cicero rhetoric, Cicero this, Cicero that. So there are subdivisions. When there is no author, then there are titles, and that's when it becomes tricky. And one example is the one that you notice, it traité vétérinaire upgraded to Tractatus Veterinarius, which in fact was a very ordinary treatise on horse keeping. What's the word for sort of looking at horses' teeth and hooves and stuff like that? So yeah, that's one of the most common manuscripts in vernacular that you find in Italian libraries. So it was equivalent of having it. Everybody had horses and needed it. Yeah, so going back to that, I think the titles often, some things have titles, other titles are in the Incipit, and they were taken from the Incipit, and sometimes are not the official titles because they didn't know, but not official titles, the accepted titles. So titles can be a tricky thing when you're working in this period, because the scholarship wasn't advanced enough to say, okay, we know this by this title. Doing one today, that was quite a funny one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that clear?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm interested in exactly how they're coming up with these titles, where they're deriving them from.
Yeah.
And how consistent they are. I guess, is a book of hours always hore, or is it
usually Italian ones are of ufficio, or if they're in Latin, but there's book of hours could be anything again. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm just curious, but what kind of patterns there were. So thank you very much. I'm sure I'll have more questions for you at some point about it.
We have another question from Lynn Ransom. Do you want to jump in?
Hi, yeah, thank you. This is just to follow up on Olivia's, because I think that's a really interesting question. It's a very large archive to just be author and title. So I was wondering if that is the case, if it's just consistently arranged by author and title, or is there some kind of like other system that develops where there's cross-referencing? And I'm thinking like in DeRicci's card archives at the Senate House Library, there were different sort of categories of organizations that he could cross-reference. Does it get that complex, or is it just simply author and title throughout?
Well, I don't think I can say yet, because I haven't looked at only a third, more or less. I haven't seen cross-references, interestingly.
Mm-hmm.
And that I should have by now, because but no, there's no cross-references. No. As far as I have seen, but probably I haven't worked it out yet. It might be one of those funny sequences.
Yeah.
Yes, and there's a lot of things which basically manuscripts are such a small part of it, and there's a lot of things that he published himself that were publishing. So there's a lot of things that you have to go through a lot of cards.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Thank you.
No, thank you for your question. That's something to think about for next time I go.
Any other questions, comments? Federico, I was wondering what the next steps are for this project. Other than getting back into the archive.
Of course, going back to Italy is the priority. No, no, I think in this case it's because I imagine, of course, there's going to be more Jews coming out from the cards, but I imagine what I would like to do is this be part of a bigger study on Orszki and on how he traded manuscripts, which is still a thing there's lots to do. But I think the most interesting thing is how to find to find the word that he worked. That what I didn't expect. That is to find all these corrections one on top of the other. And so I think we're looking. You can establish patterns of the way these people worked. And of course, the people who work with Orszki were very capable people, and we have only one name. And they were fascinated to know who they were and what they did. Well, one on Demarinus, of course, but that's another story. Yeah, no, I think it's part of a bigger study on Orszki manuscript.
Right. Relatedly, Lynn just added a follow-up which relates to my question, which is how much of this material has been digitized, and do you foresee it being widely digitized? Especially the handwriting, holograph manuscripts, that is.
Well, it all depends on the Council of the Region of Tuscany, who owns the object, is whether they would do a massive a project of this scale, which I think will be quite interesting, but it's up to them. But I cannot comment on that.
So most of those pictures were just taken by you then, I assume. Yeah. Interesting. That could be the subject of another seminar, which is how few of our heritage is still not digitized, how few pieces of our heritage are still not digitized. But that's another subject to dwell on. So one of our colleagues, Jane Roberts, just entered a question in the text. How many cards relate to a single manuscript?
Okay, that's an interesting question. It's something that I should have mentioned. Usually, I think I found of the 335 or 235, whatever they were, only 3 or 4 had two sets of cards, not many. So they basically recycle the same cards. And sometimes, in the early days, you find, particularly with the mysterious hand 03, he or she copied, made a big mess of corrections in one card and then copied. I think I found 2 or 3 like that copied in a clean card. But does it to be very few of those. And I think some have type cards, but it's a very small proportion. Like, for example, the Book of Hours that I showed that was sold to Raivozzi in Denmark. I think it was a type version and a handwritten version. Very few.
Interesting. Laura, you had another question, I think.
I did. It comes out of something that Federico was just saying about the cards as evidence for training booksellers, which is, I think, a real unexpected find of this line of inquiry. And I wondered whether, having done your big reveal and identified Demarinus' handwriting in these cards, whether you can take the line of thought further and see whether does Demarinus have a similar card index that may or may not survive? Did he employ the same methods when he set up on his own, or did he do something different? Can we start to see an intellectual tradition or a training tradition that carries through from one to the next?
There are things I've been thinking about that a lot, but still there's a lot to be done. But Demarinus, for example, adopts, I think, the same system of accession numbers with this same one sequence, just chronological, more or less. Then the Demarinus catalogs are not as, I must say, that sometimes a bit sloppy. And there's typos, there are quite a lot of typos, there are things that are missing, errors, etc. And then the use of the French is quite far less good than Olszki's catalogs. It's sometimes a bit strange. Yeah, it would be interesting to see. I think what I should do is to try to put together all the cards of the Demarinus and see if there is an evolution. But the Demarinus already had his training in Naples with Margheri, so he wasn't a virgin boy when he arrived to Florence, to put it that way. But I'm sure he learned a lot from Olszki.
No, that's a good point, that actually people don't just learn in one place. So it's straightforward. Interesting thing to continue thinking about there. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Well, you've had several thank you notes in the chat box. And we've almost been going for an hour. Last call for questions. All right. Thank you again, Federico, for doing this. It was really wonderful to hear about the nuances of your work, and looking forward to hearing more how the project progresses, as it's a landmark IES project. So let's give a round of applause virtually for Federico. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you for your attention. And I hope you all had lunch and you haven't skipped lunch. Very important.
Someday there may be biscuits involved in the Unfinished Business seminar again.
Those days when we share a cup of coffee, yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I'll see you soon at the next Unfinished Business seminar.